You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening because we have as our guest Roger Keats, who would like to be the next Cook County Board President. He is the Republican nominee, just came off a victory in the Republican primary. We're taping the show on March 28th, the year 2010. Mr. Keats is somebody who grew up in Cook County. He grew up in Hyde Park, grew up in Evanston, University of Michigan undergrad, University of Illinois master's degree, Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army, 28 years in the Army, 26 years in the Army Reserves, 2 years as an active member of the U.S. Army. Worked in District of Columbia under Dr. Fulner, who was later became the head of the Heritage Foundation, worked with Jack Kemp at that time. Taught school, he was a banker, elected to the State House at the age of 28. 2 years later, elected to the State Senate.
Yes, 30.
Spent then 14 years in the State Senate.
16 years total, yep.
Pushed tax incentives for the West Side. We may talk a little bit more about that. Mr. Keats says he is both biracial and bipartisan. Biracial in the sense of you work with people who are white, black, Hispanic.
When I say multiracial, yes.
Multiracial.
Because when you're getting a real compromise and a real bipartisanship, it's important that we reach out to all the various people in the county, which is, I'm the only one with any track record of ever having done that.
And bipartisan, and he's worked on reform of the Cook County courts. He's worked on mass transit restructuring with Mayor Harold Washington, worked on reform in the state legislature of Illinois financial services, bringing the banking system in Illinois into the modern world with branch banking as opposed to unit banking, as they used to call it.
When I was elected, it was all unit banking, and that was part of the reason we had some trouble with some of the larger banks, because they had no ability to have a broader footprint. And actually, it was helpful both smaller and bigger banks to give them the ability to spread out a little bit more.
All right, and Mr. Keats, we should say, last but certainly not least, he's held the title of honorary co-chair of the Black Caucus, right?
Yes, I did.
From Earlene Collins.
Earlene Collins called me that, yes.
So you're going to get the endorsement from Earlene Collins, who you would like to be one of your fellow colleagues on the Cook County Board?
Earlene was a pleasure to work with in the Senate and will be a pleasure to work with on the county board. She's somebody who's never been afraid to take on people. I mean, yes, I know she's a Democrat county board member, but when she thinks the Democrats are strayed, she's not afraid to side with Republicans and independents and bipartisan action. She has a good, strong track record.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, I think she was kind of the Sandra Day O'Connor of the Cook County Board because you'd have a split a few years ago, 8-8, and she would be the deciding vote.
The interesting part on the county board, and that's what people miss, is even though there are 5 Republicans and 12 Democrats, the Democrat factions are fairly well split, and so the fact that the 5 Republicans vote pretty much as a block allows them to actually have far more influence, and then there's a lot of Democrat infighting between what you call more independent, more traditional, and then some who just, the Bill Beavers of the world who are just the pork barrelers.
So Roger, tell me, Roger Keats, running for Cook County Board President, are you running against Todd Stroger? Or are you running against Tony Preckwinkle? Does the ghost of Todd Stroger still exist? Many of the things people would guess that motivated you to run were the actions and policies of Todd Stroger. Are they right in that, and are you still running against those policies even though Todd Stroger's name is not on the ballot? It's Tony Preckwinkle, the nominee of the Democratic Party for Cook County Board President.
I'm running against the insiders. I have a bipartisan record. Party is not a big issue. I'm running against the insiders. And when you go from Todd Stroger, an insider, to Tony Preckwinkle, an insider, it's like taking the up elevator on the Titanic. It doesn't really do you any good. It's the same group, and there is no significant difference between any of the candidates who are the insider candidates, because they're still aligned with Michael Madigan and Joe Barrios, the pay-to-play twins. And Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the House and the state chairman of their party, he is the epicenter of corruption. This is the problem in the state of Illinois. And if you're allied with Joe Barrios, and remember Alderman Preckwinkle, who's a 20-year incumbent alderman, was the person who renominated Joe Barrios to be their county party chairman. So it's not like she's independent of the status quo, the insiders who've made the mess. So it's hard to assume that you're going to change the mess when you're part of the mess and you're actively supported by and supportive of these people.
Now, people may be confused. What is Speaker Mike Madigan, who's, of course, Speaker of the Illinois House for most of the last 3 decades?
Yes, almost 3 decades.
He is, I would say, the most powerful
Absolutely.
Politician in the state of Illinois, certainly as leader of the chairman of the Democratic Party, as well as being Speaker of the House. But what does he have to do with Cook County Board?
Well, number one of Cook County's biggest problems are the unfunded mandates, because Mike Madigan, part of the way he increases his power is he'll give things to the various special interest groups, but he doesn't pay for them. He'll mandate them to municipal governments, county governments, whatever. So that's number one. Number two, that he's the epicenter of corruption of the pay-to-play system. Remember, according to the New York Times and the Chicago News Bureau, he took home between 2006 and 2008 a minimum of $25 million. I think it was higher than that. When you talk about pay-to-play, you're talking about a man who was well paid to frankly rip off the Cook County taxpayers by his ability to manipulate the county property tax system. He is one of the lead guys in the mess that we call the Cook County property tax system. Remember, the average Cook County property assessment, as assessed by the assessor, is off by 300%. If you were off by an average of 300% in the private sector, how long would you be employed?
The average assessment is off by 300%?
2.97% according to the state equalizer formula, just short of 300% on average wrong.
And who, according to who?
The state equalizer, because of the state distribution systems, they need to equalize assessments around the state to make sure who's assessing correctly. So the county assessor, the Cook County assessor, on average, is off by 300%.
Does that mean
on average
that people's relative tax bills are off by 300%, or does it mean that people altogether are paying inflated tax revenue?
What it in reality means is it allows them to manipulate the system. You remember this report done by the University of Illinois Chicago and the Better Government Association, Andy Shaw's group. What they discovered, one of the biggest sources of corruption in Cook County, because it's the big source of money that can be shifted around, is this corporate property tax system. And the big lawyer who manipulates this is Michael Madigan and his firm, and the guy who lets him do it is Joe Barrios, the county chairman, who, remember, has been very successful as a lobbyist in Springfield.
What's his official position in Cook County?
He is on the Board of Tax Appeals, and he's running for Cook County Assessor. So you have Mr. Pay-to-Play Mike Madigan, Mr. Pay-to-Play Jr. Joe Barrios, and this is what's
so how does Mike Madigan, people give him legal fees to try to get tax reductions in the real estate assessments, right?
Correct. Well, tax adjustments. See, in the old days, they were called bribes, and you went to prison. You bribed the alderman or the assessor, and they went to prison. Now, because Joe Barrios is there, they figured out a way to technically do it as an attorney. So now, instead of a bribe, it's called a legal fee.
A legal fee to Mike Madigan. And then
to Mike Madigan.
And then how does that involve Joe Barrios?
Because Joe Barrios is a member of the Board of Tax Appeals who decides whether he gets that assessment change.
And why does Joe Barrios, you're saying he does something that he shouldn't do because Speaker Mike Madigan is asking for it?
No, what I'm saying is the system is so corrupt that it is so open, this level of corruption. This is just how they do it. This is how they finance their party. This is how they make multimillionaires out of insiders. And this is why my opponent, a nice enough, well-intentioned lady, cannot do the things she says she'd like to do, because you have to take on the leaders of her own party, the leaders of the insiders, who, by the way, are her chief supporters, and by the way, she happens to support them.
So what would you do specifically that Tony Preckwinkle can't do, you think?
Well, a lot of it you can be done administratively. And what you do at the Board of Tax Appeals, you've heard me say the first thing I'm going to do is fire about 150 of Todd Strozer's friends and relatives, and then put in 25 new inspector generals, assistant inspector generals, and I'm going to turn them loose, and one of the big ones will be the Board of Tax Appeals. And we want to start following Madigan, how he gets clients, how he gets these changes in assessments, why he gets these buildings that seem to be inappropriately assessed, so that he can get these huge drops. Remember, in a 2-year period, he got reductions of $490 million. Okay, those are massive reductions. He and one other firm represent $1 billion of reductions.
So are you going to try to show that the reductions were inappropriate?
Well, what I'm going to show is the system of how they get them is inappropriate. In the old days, those were called bribes. Now, because they're much more sophisticated, they're called legal fees, but it's the same thing. Because why should you have an assessment system? And this is what's so important for the homeowner. As we shift the property taxes from corporate property to the homeowner, Mike Madigan, when he changes $500 million, guess who now has to pick up that tax burden? It's the homeowner living on the Northwest and Southwest or Garfield Park or wherever they are. They're the ones who are picking it up.
All right. Let me come back to that. Cook County sales tax, you would repeal. So far, half of the Cook County sales tax that was increased by 1%, half was repealed under Todd Stroger, right?
Right. Now, they overrode his veto, but it isn't repealed till July 1st. It
doesn't go into effect July 1st, right. 2010.
And the big difference between my opponent and myself, we both say we're in favor of reducing it. Her position, though, is taking off the second 0.5%. The difference with her position is she says, I'll do it when I get the revenues to replace it, i.e. so she's going to raise taxes here to cut taxes there. In other words, she's not cutting the taxes. Or in my case, I say we'll reduce the size and scope of government.
Is the difference that, is it that Alderman Preckwinkle says the county can't get by unless they find another source of revenue with that loss of the additional 0.5%?
Actually, she hasn't said that at all. She
But
just said she's going to reduce it.
But, well, you're saying she's going to reduce it. She says she'll reduce it if she finds another source of revenue.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And your point is if she doesn't find another source of revenue, you're arguing she won't reduce it.
Correct.
Okay. But I'm saying, what would you say to her if she said, your way is irresponsible, because she might argue the Cook County can't get by in the services they provide without that additional 0.5%?
Well, I would demonstrate to her with 23,000 employees who on average make more than their private sector counterparts, who have substantially better benefits, and quite frankly have some of the best pensions in the entire country. There's plenty of room to deal with those areas. Remember, the state of Illinois as a whole is short $120 billion of unfunded pension mandates that have put in by, most of them put in by the legislature through collective bargaining contracts. If we would start to get serious about too many employees, benefits that are too excessive, and then come back to examples like the county hospital. If you will run the county hospital more efficiently, and you look at this oversight board, Warren Batts and Bill Foley, who are doing a fantastic job, and the other board members.
Who are those guys?
Warren Batts is chairman of the Health and Hospital Systems Oversight Board, Governing Board, and then Bill Foley is executive director. But there are other members who work with them closely. And they have actually shown how you can increase services while decreasing costs. See, if you view yourself as a public service provider, not a patronage army, you can save an awful lot of money. And that's the problem we've run into, is for so long the county has been invisible. You know, before Todd Strozier was elected, I don't think most people knew we had a county government. And frankly, now half of them want to abolish the county government. But it's the point of, if you're going to have a government, it needs to be run efficiently. You got to remember two component parts: those who receive the services and those who pay for the services. You have to remember both.
Yeah, and Todd appeared on this show, and he said people have to remember about the services. So he would certainly say people knew there's a Cook County government, and they knew there was a Cook County hospital, Strozier Hospital, as it's called now, and all these clinics. Those are recipients of those services. And they would say they knew about it, that was important. You agree with Todd on that?
Up to a point. The interest groups know about it. The average person, if you were to ask them what are the average 6 million people live in Cook County, what are the functions of the government?
The people who get those services, they know about it.
Right, and the patronage workers and the patronage army and the contractors. Okay. And if you take a look at my opponent's finance records, it is just one giant mass of the bureaucrats and employees and patronage workers and insider contractors, where you notice that isn't mine.
You mean the contributions that she gets?
She receives, yes.
How much were those total contributions during the primary?
I was told 1.2 million, and she received 190,000 from one union, Service Employees Union, which represents the largest number of county employees, service employees, Acorn. They're the big brother of Acorn. So she received roughly 15% of her campaign fund from one union who represents the majority of the county employees. How are you going to fix the problem of too many employees with probably excessive benefits, et cetera, when your number one source of funding and your number one source of patronage workers is that very group? So you can say you're going to reform things, but you can't be a reformer when 15% of your campaign fund comes from one public sector group who represents a majority of the employees.
She does acknowledge that she got a significant funding from SEIU, and she would say that, but still it's not the great predominant amount of her funds, so she can be independent. That's her argument, right? You've heard her say that?
I have not heard her say that, but at the same time, that is what she would answer. Yeah. But the difference is, if you take the contractors, no-bid contractors, double dippers, the insiders from Cook County, and the unions that represent the employees, that's the majority of her campaign funds, a significant majority. She takes campaign contribution. I think she took $30,000 from a guy who's a double dipper, and 20 and all these from different groups and various aldermen. And many of these various aldermen have patronage employees working for the county. It is disingenuous if you take each of these contributions and call them separate. It's the same insider group. Don't pretend they're different. It's the same public sector unionization who represent the bureaucracy and the patronage workers. It's the same insider aldermen, the same insider ward committeemen, the same insider double dippers. That's a very huge majority of her campaign fund.
So are you saying, what are you looking for in terms of contributions?
I'm saying I need a budget of at least $1 million to be competitive.
And how much of that will be from your own funds, and how much of that would you expect would be from outside contributors?
Ask me that question 90 days from now, and I would give you an answer. I will certainly contribute some, and I have some friends who say they are contributing substantial amounts. But by and large, groups who have nothing to do with the county. They're good government people who are just saying everyone knows Cook County government is an inefficient 19th century relic that has not even been looked at in over 100 years. That's why I remember Mike Quigley, who was a progressive member of the county board, who's now a congressman, in 2003 did an entire report with some of the guys from University of Northwestern University Business School and some others on how to reorganize county government. We have 4 different county agencies who deal with the property taxes. 4 different agencies. No wonder the system's a disaster. You've got 4 different agencies, all of whom have different agendas working with it.
I mean, you mentioned Mike Quigley, who was, at one point, you may recall, there was a gang of 4. And that was Tony Perica and Forrest Claypool and Mike Quigley and Larry Sufferton. So you had 1 Republican and 3 Democrats.
But remember,
and they pushed a lot. They opposed the tax increases that John Stroger was opposing, and they pushed back on that. They were able to get the 4 other Republicans. They were able to get Erling Collins. They got a majority.
But I want you to
Is there anything like that going on now?
Yes, but remember, the Republicans were always there. Tony may have been the leader, but all 5 Republicans were there very solid. Greg Goslin, Liz Gorman, Glenn Schneider, and Peter Silvestri. They were all there. What I'm saying is they were solidly there, but those groups are all still there. The fellow who's running to replace Forrest Claypool, John Fritchie, says he's an independent. I'll take him at his word. Bridget Gaynor. There is a working majority. But what's far more important, and this is what people miss, and it's important to stress, 75% of all the reforms the president can do administratively. It's a very powerful position. It does not take a vote of the county board. The labor contracts are negotiated by me, and frankly, most of the reforms that need to be done to clean up the government can be done by me without any votes of the board.
Because of the executive authority of the president of the Cook County Board.
And I'm running to be the president, not a county board member, so it's executive functions that count.
All right. And overall, so you keep coming back to this, on the contribution side. Are there specific, would you take a pledge that there are people from whom you would not take money because you would see conflicts as Cook County Board President? Or is there a category of groups that you're saying you will not accept money from?
I would say in general, it is not, and I want to say this about Alderman Preckwinkle. I'm not saying she can't take contributions from the people she's taking them from. I'm saying taking $190,000 from one group who represents the majority of the county employees, taking $30,000 and $40,000 from double dippers and people who have large number of patronage work. If she was taking $1,000 or $2,500 from those people, I wouldn't say a word. Wouldn't say a word about it. It's $190,000 that's the issue. 15% of her entire campaign front from one group who she's going to have to negotiate collective bargaining.
So you would, if there was any one group, but can you identify the groups that you would limit to 5% or something like that? Is that the kind of rules you're trying to set out?
Yeah, in general, I'm going to say the contractors. If a contractor wants to give me a couple grand, I'm okay with that. Contractor wants to give me 50 grand, no, I'm not in favor of that. The same thing if a union wants to give me $2,500, I'll take the $2,500, but I'm not going to take $190,000 from one.
So you're going to set your own campaign contribution limit, so to speak? Well,
a little bit. Again, the University of Illinois BGA report talks about having some kind of campaign limits. They were talking, I think, $1,500. While I philosophically am okay with that, the practical problem is if your opponent's taking $190,000 from one, I can't limit myself to $1,500. If she will agree to these limits, I'll agree to the limits, but you're not going to get her to agree to them because the overwhelming majority of her campaign is from the insiders and the groups who represent the employees.
What's your theory? What is it, you're talking about economic development. What is it, do you think there's been insufficient economic development in Cook County, and what do you think is holding it back? Well,
what's holding it back is 3 things. We're high tax, high regulation, and unbelievably corrupt. We are the most corrupt county in America. We're the most corrupt state in America. Our corruption tax is the highest in the country. So you need to fight all 3 by putting in the assistant inspector generals. And I'm going to say to all the media, you included, you give me a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request. Every contract, every email, everything we do is going to be open to you. And I want you to come in. Don't give me a request. I'm going to say, come in. You dig through the files. You sit here and look at the computers. So the corruption tax I can deal with. That's something the alderman can't, because remember, those people are the people who are supporting her, paying for her campaign, and leading her party. So the corruption tax, regulations are we are a very difficult place. You got to hire the right politically connected law firm to get a permit here or there. I'm going to say, forget that stuff. You get your permit in 30 days. I'm going to assume your permit was honest. If we come back later and you put things on your permit that were wrong, you're going to face a state's attorney. But I'm going to assume you're honest so we can move the process along. And then taxes. We have got to lower taxes. I'm a supply sider. You know, when you're a high tax, high regulation, crooked place, you're not going to get economic development. But I've got another solution, because I want to bring in the guys who know it. I want to put together a private sector, not more public sector, not more feather bedding, private sector. Have the University of Chicago Business School guys, Kellogg, you know, Northwestern Business School, and then the other business schools in the county, some of the venture capital people, the private sector associations. I'm going to be very careful to bring in the employer associations like Black Contractors United in the Latino group, so that everyone's represented. But I want to bring in the groups who can say, what is working elsewhere in America and in the world? What can we do to develop entrepreneurship in Cook County? And what do I do to get the government out of the way? Our biggest problem for private sector growth in Cook County and in the state of Illinois is the government. High tax, high regulation, corrupt. If we can deal with those, which I can, and do all this within my administrative powers, other than lowering taxes, we can do this, we can make progress. And where it's important is, you know, a kid on the south side of Chicago, if he can be an entrepreneur, if he can start his own business, if he can employ 6 guys, he's independent of the government.
So you want to be entrepreneur friendly, you want to be business friendly. Part of that is lowering the sales tax.
Job friendly. I want to be job friendly.
And employee friendly, as well as employer friendly.
Right.
Because people point out you can't have employees without employers.
Right. And this is something with the alderman. She says she'd like to get more jobs, but when Walmart wanted to come into the city and hire 400 unemployed people, she opposed it. You cannot say you're in favor of jobs, but being opposed to the people who employ them. You keep Walmart out of the city. We lost tax revenues in the city and the county. We lost 400 jobs, all on the south side, all in the 21st Ward. You can't say...
Is that because of her ties to unions?
Exactly.
But is she going to say you're anti-union? Are you going to hear that argument?
No, not at all, not at all.
What's the difference between you and her on unions, other than she got the substantial contributions from SEIU? The difference between
me is she does everything they ask her to do. I'll gladly talk to them, and when they're reasonable positions, I will certainly support them, and when they're not, well, if we're not, we'll go opposite directions. It's an independent factor. Remember, my campaign
is that what reform is about? When you say independent, you're a reformer, you're questioning whether Toni Preckwinkle is independent and whether she's a reformer.
Right.
You're hitting that right head on, right?
If you say you're an independent reformer, show me some interest group from your insider group that you're independent of, and she has none, and show me what you've ever reformed. She's a 20-year alderman. She's a 20-year ward committeeman.
But you would agree she has that reputation in the city council of being an independent relative to other aldermen. You would agree she has that reputation, right?
I would say she calls herself that.
You don't think others who are...
I would say, show me.
Mainstream media, do they think
of
Toni as a...
Talks cheap. Show me. Talks cheap.
You can't think of anything she's done to reform in the city of Chicago?
Show me something.
When she votes against the mayor, do you think that's...
When she votes against the budget and she loses 47-3, all that shows is you're ineffective.
But initially she was against the Olympics. She became for it, which she argues she had got changes made as an independent that made it acceptable. Is that her argument? You don't
Whatever
buy it?
she says.
You don't buy it?
I'm not going to argue that, because that's, and she's entitled to that position. What I'm saying is, if you're an independent reformer, you have to win once in a while. When the leadership of both parties, and at that point Jane Byrne opposed us on cleaning up the RTA, I spent 3 years fighting it. When Harold Washington came in, Harold and I aligned. We put it together. For 20 years, the RTA worked just fine. Bipartisan, multiracial coalitions. 3 years to get it done. When we had all the ghost payrollers. You know, the Tribune and the Inspector General just found all these ghost payrollers at City Hall. She did nothing about it. They all work in the City Council. When I found ghost payrollers and the leadership of both parties didn't want to do anything about it, I went to Dick Kay, went around him, legendary newsman Dick Kay. He won the Peabody medallion.
When was that?
Oh, in the early 80s.
So are they going to argue, well, that was fine then, but Roger Keats hasn't been involved in things in the last 20 years?
Well,
is that going to be their argument?
They could argue that, but the difference is, if you've shown you were effective or you've showed you're ineffective, I've shown I could accomplish things by working in a multiracial, bipartisan manner. And I just say to an alderman who's been there 20 years, could you tell me what bipartisan thing you have ever done? What reform you have ever enacted? Please, tell me, because no one else can find it either. That's the difference. We'll both say we're independent reformers. The difference is I've walked the walk, I've talked the talk. She talks the talk.
Is there, when you come down to this, I mean, when you get into the nitty-gritty of the politics, in order for you to win, you're going to have to do very well with the African-American vote, right? How much of the African-American vote do you have to get?
If you look at roughly numbers, And you have to take that the assumption is the Democrat vote turnout will be down a little bit from '06, and the suburban vote totals will be up a little bit from '06. Our candidate got almost 47% of the vote, Tony Preka, in 2006. And he got about 7 or 8% of the minority vote. If I can get close to 20% or a little better than 20% of the black vote, which many people will say is very realistic. I was honored for Black History Month in 2009. I've been honored in front of Operation Push. My economic development concepts fit very well within the middle-class minority community who are the voters who show up consistently. I need to get 20-some% of the Latino vote, which for a Republican is not an unrealistic number at all. And then a standard suburban vote, if you take a look at that, I win.
How much of the vote is about race? Tony Preckwinkle is African-American. You are white.
I am, but I'm the only candidate in this race who's ever been honored for Black History Month. I'm the only candidate in this race who has ever been honored in front of Operation Push. And so you have a situation where the middle-class minority community on the South Side realizes that I will probably offer far more opportunity. Does that mean I'll carry those wards? No, I don't have to. But if I can get 20-some% on the South Side of Chicago, that's a different world.
So what is it when you go out to the black churches, you go out to the minority areas, you go out to the Hispanic areas, are you saying anything different than you would be saying in the North Shore and in the suburbs?
Absolutely nothing different, but where I'll tell you the significance is, I remind people, the alderman's supporters, she has to reward her supporters. So she's going to have to give jobs to Michael Madigan of the 13th Ward, Tom Hines in the 19th, and Joe Barrios. She has to get rid of people who live in the South Side right now to reward her supporters. I don't, so I will do far less harm in the middle-class minority community on the South Side, but I will do something about private sector jobs, which she won't. And so I will certainly do less harm. I will make sure that the people who are there are treated fairly.
What will you do about the county hospital? Or is it a draw there? Would you both do the same things? Do you both support the independent board?
Well, the difference is I support the independent board as is. She wants to change the stakeholders so the independent board is no longer independent. So it becomes a titular independent board, but she'll change the membership so that it's not independent anymore. It'll be an insider board. But the concepts of what the health and hospitals governing board is doing, everyone knows it's got to be done. It's 1/3 of the entire county budget. We have got to find a way to generate revenue and give the services less expensive. That's where my concept of using the clinics, expanding a clinic system. Some comes to an emergency room, it's $1,000. They go into a clinic, it's $75 to $150. So you start setting up these clinics.
So your point, it helps the users, because then if you're spending your money more wisely, there's more money for them, and there's also more money going back to taxpayers.
Exactly.
Taxpayers are more in support of that.
And let me even go a step farther, and they get better service. You come in an emergency room, you might sit there 8 hours if it's a minor illness. You go in a clinic, you got an appointment, and you're taken care of immediately.
We're going to continue to speak as the credits roll, but I very much want to thank Roger Keats, who is he is the Republican nominee running for president of the Cook County Board. That election is coming up in November. We're taping this on March 28th. It's going to be a long campaign. You expect these issues to be getting hashed back and forth. What do you think? Two most important issues come November.
Taxes and corruption.
So you're saying there's a big difference, because you're saying you will repeal the remaining half a percent on the sales tax. You will look for other taxes, other burdens, other regulations to knock off that would increase, that would be good for economic development.
Right, because if you can deal with the cost of doing business and the corruption, then the economic development comes back.
And the corruption is, what are you doing on corruption that Tony Preckwinkle isn't doing? 25
assistant inspector generals, wide open FOIA requests for all the media, and then I'm going to start handing this stuff over to
Tony said she wouldn't do that yet, or you haven't heard a response?
She's not handed any 25 new assistant inspector generals, because she knows perfectly well who they're going to find, because those are her insider supporters, the pay-to-play twins, Mike Madigan and Joe Barrios. I'm going to go after the Board of Tax Appeals.
Do you think you can tie Tony Preckwinkle to Speaker Mike Madigan?
Does water go over Niagara Falls?
Is that something, does that play with voters? Do people look at that as Speaker Mike Madigan a big negative?
Yes, they do, and particularly in the minority community, he's looked at as a big negative because he's so heavy-handed, and the level of corruption. When he takes home $25 million and a Latino's out there struggling to get a minimum wage job,